Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and this is a starter guide for Bloodborne on the PlayStation 4. I'll be going by the latest version of the game as of time of writing, early 2016. So it's possible that minor changes could still take place in the game after, but for the most part this info should be entirely relevant. And of course, if you're completely new to the Souls and Bloodborne series, you might want to check out my videos on Dark Souls 1 and 2. More so Dark Souls 1. Although Bloodborne is not a Souls game, it shares many similarities in game design and the approach one should take when playing. Much like Dark Souls and Demon Souls, Bloodborne is a game best played blind, going in without knowing anything. That said, here are some tips that will help you get started in Yharnam on your hunt, as the game doesn't do its best to explain some things, and there are some things that you really do need to know. Mechanically speaking, Bloodborne is very close to Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls, so if you've played either of those games you should be relatively comfortable jumping in here. Of course, there are some changes to how the game is played, and we'll cover those here. The biggest change of course would be that shields are rare in Bloodborne, meaning that your character's defense is heavily dependent on positioning and evasion. What does this mean? Well, that you will have to study your opponents, the beasts that you hunt, watch and learn their movements, find the opportune time to strike. Whilst there are no shields, you'll find that the evasion mechanics in Bloodborne are very rewarding and forgiving. For the most part, there is only one evade in Bloodborne. Whether you are a heavy character or a light character doesn't come into play. Your dodge move will always be the same speed, the same type. When locked on, your character will sidestep, backstep and so forth. If you are not locked on, then you will do a Dark Souls style roll. There's no real difference between these, but generally you're going to be locked on. Either way, they use little stamina and can be used in quick succession, and although it seems counterproductive, you will want to practice the art of dodging into enemy attacks, as opposed to away from them. It isn't realistic and it might seem illogical, but your character is invincible during most of the dodge animation, so you want to take advantage of that to dodge through an enemy's attack, putting you in their blind spot, behind them, flanking them, anything like that. A good position to counterattack. Whereas Dark Souls was a slower, more defense-oriented game for the most part, Bloodborne is all about savage, relentless attacks. The enemies will do their best not to give you any time to breathe, any chance to recover, and you must fight fire with fire. The beasts hate fire after all. That's where the regain or rally mechanic comes into play. What the game describes as rallying is quite a simple mechanic both in practice and concept. When you are struck by an enemy, you have a chance to regain some of that health if you strike the enemy right away. It's a very important mechanic in Bloodborne that encourages you to push on instead of backing away. That said, you do have to balance it. Sometimes it will pay off to stay in the thick of things and slash away, whereas at other times you will have to retreat or die. But for the most part, Bloodborne rewards very aggressive play. In keeping with that, we have Bloodborne's equivalent of the parry and riposte, the Visceral Attack. If you manage to shoot an enemy during the middle of their attack with your gun, you will stun them for a brief period, in which you can close the distance and land a Visceral Attack by using your standard R1 attack. It is a powerful attack that can be used on most enemies and even a lot of bosses. Visceral attacks scale with both your total level and the level of your skill stat, amongst other things, and it is entirely possible to completely build your character around them. And bear in mind, that is the primary use of the gun in Bloodborne. The gun isn't your damage dealer in most cases. Your gun is to set up for visceral attacks. To that end actually, we have the weapon transforming mechanic. If you tap L1 with most weapons, your character will transform their weapon into a second state. This could change it from a one-handed weapon into a two-handed weapon, or it could change the attacks and its properties, or even just enchant the weapon. There's a wide variety of changes, and while some are certainly more useful than others, transforming weapons and their attacks can be crucial to success. If we take the Saw Cleaver for example, we can attack once with R1, and then hit L1 to transform the weapon and continue our combo, and then we can hit L1 again to engage in a transform combo, which can be extremely powerful for reasons I'll go into shortly. But always be aware of transform attacks. If you find a weapon you like, try out all sorts of combos like R1, R1, L1, R1, L1, R1. You never know what sort of fun, crazy, or terrible combo you might come up with. There is no poise in Bloodborne, so to speak, nor is there, strictly speaking, equip burden, but you will find similar elements. Certain weapons have hyper armor on certain attacks, which acts very similar to poise. You will take damage from an attack, but it won't interrupt or stun you, so if you're charging up a big hammer blow, you will still land your attack even if they hit you, but you will take damage from the attack. As for equip burden, you'll find that certain items will have an impact on your stamina regen, but not much of an effect on your speed in general, so you don't really need to worry about it. You don't need to worry about taking 2 giant weapons and all that stuff. Likewise, armor cannot be upgraded in Bloodborne, so you are free to use whatever visually appeals to you. There is no best armor or anything like that. You'll be perfectly fine going through the entire game with one set. There are some other interesting new mechanics in Bloodborne too, such as Beasthood. You could think of Beasthood as a sort of rage mode or hyper mode for your character. When you enter Beasthood, relentless strikes and powerful blows will increase your Beasthood meter. As the meter fills, your damage will increase, but you will also take more damage from enemies. The total size of the meter determines how much bonus damage you will do, and the total size of the meter itself is determined by your Beasthood statistic. So you might find some armor which has 20 Beasthood and then one which has 10. So if you want more Beasthood, you obviously take the one with 20. So let's say you have 100 Beasthood and you fill your meter. That could give you, say, 40% more damage with a full meter. But if you have 500 Beasthood and then fill your meter, it could be like 70% more damage. Beasthood presents a very good risk-reward style of gameplay, and whilst it can usually only be activated by certain consumable items you find in the game, you might eventually find weapons or other tools that allow you to permanently remain in Beasthood, or Beast mode, whatever you want to call it. As for building the Beast meter, remember transform attacks and that combo I mentioned? These tend to fill the meter rapidly, so if you're able to chain them together you can unleash ridiculous amounts of damage in a very short amount of time. Another new mechanic is Insight. You could think of it as this game's version of humanity, in some ways. Insight is gained through items and by witnessing certain events in the game world. Once obtained, you can spend it on items or multiplayer functionality. If you wish to summon another player, for example, it will usually cost Insight to ring the bell that allows you to summon them. That said, having very high Insight may have its downsides, so beware of raising your Insight too high, good hunter. Then we have Caryll runes. You could think of them as Bloodborne's version of rings or amulets. Once you progress to a certain point in the game, you will unlock the ability to equip several runes to your character, and these essentially give you stat boosts. They buff your character. You might get more total health, more defense, more beasthood, and so forth. Finally, we have gems. These are how you customize your weapons in Bloodborne. Whilst you can upgrade your weapons to a maximum of plus 10 using upgrade materials, you can also slot gems into your weapons that can further increase the damage, or they can change the damage. You could make your weapon do purely fire damage, for example. For the most part, it's a very straightforward process. Find gems in the world, and then slot them into your weapon, and take them out again whenever you wish. There isn't too much nuance to the system, sadly. Of course, certain enemies may be weak to certain damage types, so you might want to build towards that, but you can typically just go with whatever works for you personally. Elsewise, weapon scaling works very similar to Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2. If your weapon has an S in the description, that means it scales really well with strength, or skill, or whatever, and then you will gain a large benefit from your strength stat, and so forth. But there's no real magic in Bloodborne. Instead, we have Hunter Tools. These are various items you will find in the game world that serve a variety of purposes, and generally require your Quicksilver bullets to operate. Almost everything in Bloodborne uses the same resource: your blood. Quicksilver bullets are used to power your gun and almost every hunter tool, and whilst you can typically carry around 20 bullets at a time, you can create more bullets on the fly at any time by hitting up on the D-pad. This will take a portion of your health and transform it into 5 bullets, and you can restore your lost health primarily with Bloodvials. Like bullets, you can typically carry 20 at a time. However, unlike in the Dark Souls games, you will not restore these at checkpoints. Instead, you will have to obtain them manually. You will find that enemies drop Bloodvials fairly frequently, and you can also buy them, and you can store, 600 or something. You can store hundreds of them in your storage box. And if you die, so let's say you have 20, you use them all, then you die, and you have 30 in your item storage. It will take 20 from your storage and replenish them automatically. However, if you run out of Bloodvials completely, like none in your storage, you'll essentially have no way to heal. And it is entirely possible to die several times to a tricky boss and find yourself with no Bloodvials. In times like these, it's good to have some spare blood echoes on hand to buy some, or spend some time farming them in an easy location. As for blood echoes, they are Bloodborne's version of souls. They are a universal currency that you use for almost everything. Leveling up, powering up your weapons, buying from shops. All of this is done with blood echoes, which are obtained by killing enemies. Sometimes you will also receive cold blood, which are essentially itemized blood echoes that you can keep for when you might need some. Such as if you die but you need to repair your weapons before going to retrieve your echoes from your bloodstain. Because, much like Dark Souls, if you die, you will drop all of your blood echoes into a blood pile, a blood stain on the floor where you died, giving you one chance to retrieve them by returning to that spot. But that shouldn't be a challenge for you now, should it? Strictly speaking, there are no classes in Bloodborne. You are a hunter. Every player is a hunter. That is your class. But you can choose the background of your hunter, and this will determine your starting statistics. By and large, this isn't a hugely impactful decision. It will only have an impact on your starting stats, and how many blood echoes you start with. But even then, it's like 400 blood echoes or 500 blood echoes. It's like virtually no difference. Every background can eventually use every weapon in the game, and so forth. Every character begins with the same clothes equipped and access to the same 3 melee weapons and 2 ranged weapons. So really, there's not much difference between them. Personally, I think Military Veteran is the best origin, for it has high strength and skill, and many weapons scale fairly well with both of those in Bloodborne. But there are no bad origins or classes, just go with whatever suits you from a role-playing perspective. Once you've made your character and made your way into the game world, you'll soon have a choice between 3 melee weapons: the Saw Cleaver, the Hunter's Axe, and the Threaded Cane. You could think of these as your balanced weapon, the Saw Cleaver, strength weapon, the axe, and skill weapon, the cane. They are all good in their own ways, and depending on who you ask, you will get many different answers on which is the best, so take whichever appeals to you the most. Personally, I think the Hunter's Axe is probably the best, but that is only because there is an equivalent, and in my opinion superior Saw Cleaver you can pick up early in the game. So, personally I would take the Hunter's Axe and then pick up the Saw Spear weapon for free, as I find that combo extremely efficient, and if you look at my boss guide videos for Bloodborne, you'll see that I use the Saw Spear to pretty damn good effect, I would say. But they're all really good in their own ways. I mean, people love the cane, just it's not really my thing. In fact, Practically every weapon in Bloodborne is really good and really powerful. That said, unfortunately, upgrade materials are far more limited than in the Souls games, and if you want to upgrade every weapon to a maximum level, it will take you a very long time, even with the patches that have introduced more ways to obtain the rare materials. Speaking of rare materials, we have our final part of this starter guide, the Chalice Dungeons. These are semi-randomised dungeons in which you will find some of the game's best runes, best gems, best everything. To create a Chalice dungeon you will need both a chalice and certain ritual materials that can be found throughout the game. However, they are typically more of an end game inclusion, so you don't really need to challenge them early on. They are entirely optional and you can complete the game without ever setting foot in them. In fact, you don't even really need me talking about them in a starter guide, but I thought I might as well touch on them. Progressing through the Chalice dungeons will generally unlock the next one, until you have cleared the main set, and at that point you can delve into the Root Chalice dungeons, and Root Chalice dungeons are essentially more randomised ones. Every Chalice dungeon has its own ID code that can be shared between players, and this can be useful for finding specific high level runes, or a specific weapon configuration, or anything like that. By and large, however, Chalice dungeons are something you won't be looking into until the end of the game. They are separate from your campaign progress and new game cycles, so even if you get into like New Game plus 5 before ever setting foot in the Chalice dungeons, their difficulty will not scale up to New Game plus 5, so don't worry about that. That said, some of the deep dungeons are very painful, and in fact that sums up Bloodborne quite well. There are times when you may think the game is impossible, that this boss or that enemy is impossible, it can't be defeated, and yes, Bloodborne is probably harder than Dark Souls or Demon Souls. It's probably the hardest Souls-like game, but there's always a way. Remember, you are a hunter. Study the beasts, find their weaknesses and exploit their weaknesses. And a hunter need not hunt alone. There are plenty of others who would help you, and failing that, I do have the aforementioned playlist of boss guides that covers a handful of bosses in the game. But such guides should only be used as a last resort. Overcoming the challenge with your own perseverance is what it's all about after all, so don't think too hard about all this. Just get out there and hunt some beasts. You know, it's just what hunters do.